Imagine millions of eyes across Southeast Asia focused on a single burning question. When tragedy unfolds in Gaza, who will step up, China or the Muslim-majority nations at the heart of ASEAN? Today, as bombs flatten buildings and civilians in Gaza search desperately for safety, a spotlight swings not toward the West, but toward Beijing and the capitals of Southeast Asia. The world has seen Beijing make calculated, headline-grabbing moves in Middle Eastern diplomacy. So where does that leave Indonesia, Malaysia, and others whose people share deep religious and humanitarian ties to Palestine? Are ASEAN's Muslim leaders ready to match China's assertive engagement, or will economic interests and political caution keep them on the sidelines? The answer isn't just about geopolitics or faith, it's about how money, technology, and shifting alliances are redrawing the map of power right now. Let's take a step back. ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, is a diverse club of 10 countries with a combined population nearing 700 million. Their differences, economic, cultural, and religious, run deep, but as a bloc, their influence is undeniable. On paper, they are committed to dialogue, peace, and mutual prosperity, carefully avoiding confrontational foreign policies. Yet, events in Gaza are now testing the limits of those principles like never before. What makes this crisis different? Why is there so much global attention on whether ASEAN's leaders, especially from Muslim-majority Indonesia, Malaysia, and Brunei, will take bolder action? For decades, ASEAN's approach has been careful, measured, and frankly, mostly symbolic. Condemnations in the form of joint statements, calls for humanitarian aid, and cautious diplomatic overtures have defined the norm. But with the Gaza situation escalating almost daily, and China boldly inserting itself as a potential peace broker, the stakes suddenly feel higher than ever. Only days ago, Malaysian Foreign Minister Zambry Abdul Qadir announced he would address the United Nations Security Council, raising expectations for a firmer stance. Meanwhile, Indonesia reaffirmed its commitment to supporting Palestinian refugees through UNRWA, the United Nations aid arm for Palestinian territories. Both governments are under mounting pressure from their own citizens, who continue to rally across Jakarta and Kuala Lumpur, demanding more than just words. Beneath the surface, however, are deep rifts within ASEAN. While Malaysia and Indonesia champion the Palestinian cause, Singapore and the Philippines quietly maintain security and economic relationships with Israel. These divergent priorities make a unified front all but impossible, and that's not just speculation. As Alina Noor of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace explains, ASEAN's foundational principle of non-interference in the internal affairs of member states significantly constrains its capacity to take decisive and impactful action on pressing issues such as the ongoing crisis in Gaza. But why is this principle so crucial? To truly understand, we need to rewind the clock. ASEAN was born in 1967 in a Southeast Asia racked by Cold War rivalries, insurgencies, and distrust. The principle of non-interference, enshrined as sacrosanct, was meant to keep the peace in a region so diverse it sometimes feels like a patchwork quilt. Each nation's sovereignty was, and remains, untouchable. Mission accomplished? Perhaps, but the price is visible today. When regional crises erupt, decisive collective action is almost always sacrificed at the altar of consensus and caution. Enter China. In recent years, Beijing has become increasingly assertive in Middle Eastern diplomacy, sending envoys, proposing ceasefires, and leveraging its economic muscle. When China speaks, the world listens. This reality has raised uncomfortable comparisons. Why, asks former Malaysian Law Minister Zaid Ibrahim, can China act so swiftly while Muslim-majority nations in ASEAN hesitate? Is it possible that economic ties or strategic calculations are muzzling the region's voice at a time when global attention is fixated on moral leadership? Let's look at the numbers. China's trade with ASEAN reached a record $979 billion in 2023, making the bloc China's largest trading partner. The economic gravitational pull of Beijing is enormous, so much so that even outspoken critics of Israel's policies hesitate to endanger relations with the region's economic powerhouse. Domestic political considerations, including religious sentiments and electoral calculations, frequently take precedence over humanitarian concerns, notes Greg Poling of the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Consider this: Malaysia and Indonesia are home to some of the world's largest Muslim populations, but their economies are tightly interwoven with the global tech and manufacturing supply chains, many of which are directly linked to both China and the US. Meanwhile, countries like Singapore, with a large financial sector and close security ties with Israel, cannot afford to upset the delicate balance of their international relationships. This is what Thomas Popinski of Cornell calls ASEAN's characteristic caution, the product of internal disagreements and a desire to stay neutral amidst complex geopolitical dynamics. The result? When Malaysian and Indonesian leaders pledge more aid to Gaza, it often comes with caveats, careful language, and, crucially, no drastic change in policy. For every passionate speech or condemnation from clerics and activists, there is an equal and opposite force: economic advisors, trade ministers, and foreign policy strategists urging caution. The absence of a cohesive and unified ASEAN response to the Gaza crisis highlights the inherent limitations in the organization's strategic vision and decision-making processes, observes Joshua Kurlancic of the Council on Foreign Relations. It's more than just rhetoric. Take the last 24 hours. Humanitarian groups across ASEAN scrambled to coordinate aid deliveries to Gaza, but their efforts were piecemeal, organized by NGOs, not governments. A planned ministerial meeting to coordinate a stronger ASEAN-wide response was abruptly postponed, deepening public frustration. The Philippines, for its part, simply reiterated its support for a two-state solution, without new initiatives. Singapore emphasized the need for unimpeded humanitarian access, but refrained from making new financial commitments. The picture is one of energetic grassroots activism, public protests, religious appeals for donations, and growing social media campaigns, contrasting with a diplomatic establishment that treads carefully. Even when Malaysia's Consultative Council of Islamic Organizations, MAPIM, issued a strident condemnation of recent Israeli actions, government leaders stopped short of calling for sanctions or boycotts. Why? The fear of upsetting vital trade relationships, especially as the world economy teeters on the brink, is ever present. This caution is profoundly frustrating for millions of ordinary people across the region. In Jakarta and Kuala Lumpur, demonstrators brandish banners reading "Stop the Genocide" and "Solidarity with Gaza Now," hoping to pressure their governments into concrete action. Influential preachers urge followers to give to Palestine, warning that history will judge those who remain silent. But the question lingers: can ASEAN's leaders really afford to alienate major trading partners, or is the risk of inaction even greater? The irony is stark. On one hand, the ASEAN bloc has the economic heft and population to make a global impact. On the other, it is hamstrung by internal divisions and the ever-present shadow of Chinese influence. Would a bolder stance truly jeopardize trade or investment? Or does Beijing's willingness to flex its diplomatic muscles actually offer ASEAN cover to act, if only its leaders found the will? Bilahari Kausikan, a former Singaporean diplomat, frames it bluntly. Singapore's carefully calibrated and balanced approach to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is essential for preserving regional stability and fostering constructive dialogue among diverse stakeholders. But for critics, this calibration looks more like paralysis, at a time when moral clarity could reshape the region's reputation on the global stage. Humanitarian organizations within ASEAN continue, almost heroically, to fill the gaps left by hesitant governments. Aid shipments flow, but bottlenecks, bureaucracy, and the lack of a unified command make these efforts less effective than they could be. Appeals for a joint ASEAN humanitarian fund have been floated, but so far, talk has eclipsed action. Meanwhile, China watches closely. Beijing's diplomatic overtures to both Israel and Palestine, including recent Middle East summits, have raised the prospect of a new regional power broker. Is it possible that China's visibility is forcing ASEAN's hand, or is it simply exposing the limitations of the bloc's internal cohesion? And so, as the Malaysian foreign minister prepares to address the Security Council, many ask, will anything be different this time? Or will ASEAN's endless balancing act, caught between public outrage, economic interests, and the gravitational pull of China, continue? We're left at a crossroads, with public pressure mounting, economic risks looming, and global expectations at their highest. What happens next could redefine ASEAN's role on the world stage, but are its leaders truly ready to act? So, having explored the roots of ASEAN's caution and the mounting pressure from both the public and international actors, let's look ahead. What comes next for Southeast Asia in the Gaza crisis? And what could the consequences be if this balancing act collapses? Or conversely, if leaders finally choose a bold new path? Imagine for a moment that this crisis drags on, the images and headlines growing more harrowing each day. The people in Kuala Lumpur and Jakarta, their voices already echoing through streets, become even more impatient. Anwar Ibrahim, chairing the ASEAN summit, finds himself at a crossroads. Will he continue preaching dialogue and restraint, or is there a breaking point where caution looks more like complicity? Here are several possible futures as experts see them. First, there's the path of incremental diplomatic pressure. ASEAN's foreign ministers might finally release a stronger joint communiqué, condemning both the violence and humanitarian violations, and perhaps even take the rare step of requesting a special session at the United Nations. Malaysia's upcoming address to the Security Council hints at this possibility, a signal to the world that ASEAN's voice may carry more weight. But don't expect firebrand rhetoric that jeopardizes Western business or security ties. Thomas Popinski puts it bluntly. ASEAN's characteristic caution stems from a combination of internal disagreements among member states and a desire to maintain a neutral stance amidst complex geopolitical dynamics. Second, a modest boost in humanitarian aid looms as the most likely concrete step. Indonesia, for instance, may announce new UNRWA funding, pressured by activists and religious leaders, while Malaysia could coordinate more shipments through Jordan. ASEAN NGOs are consolidating their efforts, but without robust, unified government support, these gestures, while vital, are unlikely to move the needle dramatically for Gazans. The logistical and budgetary hurdles here are real, not just political theater. A third and less probable scenario is ASEAN stepping up as a mediator. Imagine the organization offering itself as a neutral broker between Israel and Hamas, leveraging its reputation for dialogue. But as Joshua Kurlansik of the Council on Foreign Relations notes, the absence of a cohesive and unified ASEAN response to the Gaza crisis highlights the inherent limitations in the organization's strategic vision and decision-making processes. Without hard power or a united diplomatic front, mediation remains more of a symbolic aspiration than a real prospect. Even if ASEAN offers, would anyone listen? Now, let's not overlook the risks here. If ASEAN continues to equivocate, the trust between leaders and their people may erode further. What happens when faith in cautious diplomacy collapses and the public demands direct, even confrontational action? One need only look to the growing protests, the banners, the sit-ins, the religious leaders urging donations, and the hashtags calling out leaders by name. Greg Poling of CSIS warns, domestic political considerations, including religious sentiments and electoral calculations, frequently take precedence over humanitarian concerns when shaping individual ASEAN member states' policies toward the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. There's also the looming danger that ASEAN's perceived timidity could open the door wider for external powers like China to capture the narrative and the moral high ground. As China's diplomacy on Gaza grows more confident, some Southeast Asian citizens may ask the uncomfortable question, if Beijing can risk Western displeasure, why can't we? For leaders concerned with legitimacy and regional influence, this prospect is a ticking clock. Yet amidst all this, there are hidden opportunities. The crisis, as tragic as it is, has already drawn ASEAN publics closer together in empathy. Humanitarian efforts unite religious and secular groups across borders. Religious leaders in Indonesia and Malaysia seldom share a platform, but for Gaza, they do. Could this be the seed for a new, more people-focused ASEAN identity, one that transcends government caution? If you're watching from Southeast Asia, ask yourself, can pressure from below finally crack open the top-down, non-interference doctrine that's ruled ASEAN for decades? What would happen if citizens organized region-wide movements, not just for Gaza, but for other humanitarian causes? We've already seen glimpses. Maypim's statement in Malaysia, cross-border aid coordination, and Thai, Filipino, and Singaporean voices each finding ways to express solidarity without upending their foreign policies. Let's dig even deeper. What does all of this mean for you, the everyday viewer? Why should you care, and what practical lessons, if any, can you take from this grand drama of diplomacy, internal politics, and shifting allegiances? First, it's a case study in the intersection of principle and pragmatism. ASEAN's leaders can't simply follow their hearts or the loudest voices on the street. They face international constraints, fragile economies, and the ever-present risk of making things worse by acting hastily. Alina Noor, from the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, explains the bind. ASEAN's foundational principle of non-interference in the internal affairs of member states significantly constrains its capacity to take decisive and impactful action on pressing issues such as the ongoing crisis in Gaza. But this isn't just a story of helplessness. Grassroots activism is already shifting the needle, forcing leaders to at least pay lip service to public demands. If you're an activist or simply a concerned citizen, this is proof that organized, sustained pressure does make a difference, even if it's incremental. Every petition, every peaceful march, every donation chips away at the wall of caution and inaction. On a personal level, the events in Gaza and Southeast Asia's response force us to wrestle with a universal dilemma. When do we speak out, and when do we compromise? When do we risk relationships, be they diplomatic, economic, or even personal, in the name of what we believe is right? ASEAN's leaders, for all their flaws, are wrestling with the same questions you and I do, albeit on a much larger stage. Here's another lesson. Real influence isn't just about government pronouncements or summit declarations. It's about networks, the NGOs, religious councils, student groups, and ordinary people who refuse to look away. The coordinated aid movements across Southeast Asia, though imperfect and underfunded, show that you don't need to wait for permission from on high to make a difference. This is a reminder to never underestimate the power of local action in a global crisis. Finally, the crisis exposes the limitations of old frameworks. The ASEAN way, consensus, non-interference, slow and steady, is being tested as never before. As Bilahari Kausikan, a former Singaporean diplomat, puts it, Singapore's carefully calibrated and balanced approach to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is essential for preserving regional stability and fostering constructive dialogue among diverse stakeholders. But can calibration substitute for courage? Will the old mechanisms of dialogue and delay prove enough when the world is demanding more? So, to return to our original question, will ASEAN's leaders finally break from their traditional caution and take decisive action, or will geopolitics and economic interests win out again? Based on all available evidence, the answer, for now, is equivocal. ASEAN will likely take incremental steps, stronger diplomatic language, a few more aid convoys, perhaps a new fund for humanitarian relief. Malaysia's coming speech at the United Nations is set to be closely watched, and Indonesia's reaffirmation to support UNRWA speaks volumes about the region's priorities. Yet it's clear that for most governments in the region, the desire to avoid risk, maintain economic ties, and preserve internal unity outweighs the urge for bold action. The practical effect? More of the same. Cautious statements, some coordinated aid, but little in the way of decisive, history-making intervention. That doesn't mean change is impossible. The ground is shifting. Public mobilization is forcing previously unthinkable conversations. If ASEAN is to play a meaningful role in crises like Gaza, it will have to reckon with new realities. A more vocal public, a region that cannot ignore humanitarian suffering, and a rival superpower that's unafraid to take sides. As Kavi Chongkitavorn from ISIS Thailand suggests, ASEAN urgently needs to develop a more effective and coordinated mechanism for addressing humanitarian crises, while simultaneously upholding the principles of sovereignty and non-interference that define its operational framework. That challenge, how to be both principled and pragmatic, is now unavoidable. And here's a secret fact that seldom makes international headlines. In the past decade, the greatest boosts in humanitarian aid to Palestine from Southeast Asia haven't come from governments, but from grassroots coalitions, cross-border religious groups, student collectives, and online fundraising, the unheralded architecture of people power. The institutions may be slow, but the people are far less so. So, what can you do? Stay informed. Support humanitarian organizations with proven track records. If you're in Southeast Asia, add your voice to calls for government accountability. And perhaps most critically, remember that every letter, every march, every social media share matters. History isn't just written in summit halls. It's written on the streets, in homes, in quiet acts of solidarity that ripple outwards. Thank you for watching. If you found this deep dive useful, like the video, subscribe for more stories behind the headlines, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Do you think ASEAN's cautious approach is still justified, or is it time for a new, bolder chapter? Your voice is part of this story.